This is Indyliveradio, and we're about to broadcast the latest edition of our programme series, Changing Minds and Moving Forward. And this week's edition, we're with AIM, Aberdeen Independence Movement, and we're listening in to a meeting which they organised in May this year. They invited Anthony Salamone to speak to them. Anthony Salamone is a Scottish political scientist and analyst. He's the founder and managing director of European Merchants, which is a political analysis firm based in Edinburgh. In February of 2020, Anthony published a paper called The EU Blueprint, which subtitled Pathway for Scotland's Accession to the European Union under Independence. And there is mention of some of the content of that paper in today's broadcast. More recently, he's published The Global Blueprint, and that is a perspective for Scotland's foreign policy institutions, again, under independence. The meeting was chaired by Jenny Nicol with Anthony Salamone and the questions from Aberdeen Independence Movement's members.
Evening all. If you're joining us tonight and would like to know more about Aberdeen Independence Movement, we'll pop the link for our website in the chat window. We're always looking for new members and welcome anyone who's interested in learning why independence is the most positive outcome for Scotland. We have Anthony here with us tonight. He is a political scientist and writer. His primary areas of expertise rest in EU politics and institutions, Scottish politics, British politics, and international relations. He is here with us to discuss a prospectus for Scotland's foreign policy. Welcome, Anthony.
Thanks very much for inviting me. And I'm really pleased to be talking about the Global Blueprint, which is my recent report, which I published earlier this year, setting out how I think Scotland could build the institutions for foreign policy under independence. So I want to talk briefly about some of the sort of grounding principles that I used in writing the blueprint, and then maybe a bit about Scotland's role in the EU, and perhaps Scotland in the United Nations, and then sort of Scotland's relations with other countries in the world, and so see how we go from there. Yeah, so it's a big issue. I think one of the reasons I want to write this report was to try to think through how, in what I hope is a degree of detail, Scotland could establish the institutions. And it's not about, deciding particular policies on the various issues which are facing in the world, and there are plenty of them, and a lot of them are in the news right now. It's about saying, in terms of the kind of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, what it might look like, where diplomatic missions could be, and how many of them there might be. And thinking about the kinds of structures and institutions that make sense for Scotland. So, it's useful to say that, Scotland would be a relatively small state in the world. I think we were aware of this. It's not a question of Scotland sort of, driving the United Nations, but that's not to say that Scotland couldn't be successful, influential on the model of other countries that we're familiar with and we have great affinity with, be that Ireland or Finland or others. And indeed, in the report, I spend a lot of time looking at, in particular, Denmark, Finland, Ireland and Norway as useful countries of reference for Scotland, and thinking about what a Ministry of Foreign Affairs could look like, and also the kind of diplomatic footprint that makes sense for Scotland. Because, there will always be limited resources in terms of which countries you want to prioritize, which issues you think are most important, and trying to balance all of those in a strategy that makes sense for Scotland. So yes, the other point I suppose it's worth saying is that, I don't talk about how Scotland could join the EU in this blueprint. I've written about that elsewhere. And also for me, I, as a researcher and as a thinker, I make quite a big difference between EU relations or European relations and international relations. So Scotland's relations with the rest of the European Union, or the European Union and Scotland's relations with countries outside the European Union. Obviously, it would be up for people to decide after an independence referendum whether or not Scotland would be in the EU. If you've read any of my work, I think you probably would know that I would like Scotland to be in the EU. I think that would be the best option. But obviously, those are questions to be decided. So trying to get into this here. So one is what kind of foreign policy could Scotland have? Obviously, I think it's crucial to try and to not just think about Scotland's interests in terms of trade interests, or why it might be useful to be in the EU, to be in the single market, and so on, but also to think about the kinds of values that we have in terms of democracy, in terms of human rights, in terms of the rule of law, and that a foreign policy needs to combine both of these things. It shouldn't be one or the other. If it's only about Scotland's interests, then that's very sort of, cold. If it's only about values, then that can be too idealistic, because of course the world could be a challenging place. It's about so I think Scotland can and should have a values-based foreign policy, but that needs to combine both Scotland's values and interests together and try to achieve both of them, which can be challenging at sometimes, but I think it's worthwhile to try and do that. And a key part of that, of course, is not just thinking about the kinds of messages that Scotland will be sending to the world and saying, advocating, for instance, particular positions in the United Nations, saying, well, on this issue, we think this or whatever. It's about matching Scotland's internal action with its external action, because, of course, our credibility in being able to say, for instance, that, on this particular human rights issue, we believe that this should be happening and we disagree with what's happening in this particular country, is what we do in our own country. And there's a big link between that. And I don't want to see a foreign policy that was, not just trying to manage those links, but be, actively wanting to see those synergies between what we do at home and what we'll be doing abroad. So Scotland's role in the EU, I'm happy to come back to the EU part in questions, but Scotland would be a smaller member state. It would be a northern, western, relatively rich member state compared to others. There's a whole question of Scotland joining the EU and the timetable for that and the sequencing of that. And again, I'm happy to come back to that later. But I suppose in the context of this global blueprint, the question is, what kind of role would Scotland have in the foreign policy of the European Union? So that's the EU's foreign policy towards other countries. Because obviously it's becoming an important area for the EU. Traditionally speaking, the EU has not been particularly strong on foreign policy in terms of engaging with China or Russia or even the United States, because foreign policy is an area where the member states still retain a lot of control, where unanimity is often required. So all the countries of the EU would have to agree in a particular position. And they have different views. So, for instance, if you take Russia, so some states like Poland and the Baltics, obviously are very concerned about security issues. Countries like Germany and Italy are often, sometimes divided, but focus more on trade issues and so on. And other countries like Ireland are, perhaps somewhat removed from these issues, but recognize the consequences for the other member states. So yes, it's an area where there's a lot of division, and sometimes the EU can look weaker because it can't agree on a stronger position in good time. By the time the EU has decided on something, sort of the issue is kind of over. But the EU is aware of that and is working to try to enhance its profile in the world beyond the traditional areas we think of in the EU, which is often huge global ramifications, even though they're ostensibly just internal EU policies. So how would Scotland be fitting into all of that? I think that's quite crucial. I suppose we would say, what could Scotland bring to EU foreign policy that was unique, either in its relationships with particular countries, which might be useful to the EU. So I'm not sure what the answers to these questions are, by the way, but I can imagine, for instance, the bilateral relationship between Scotland and Canada could be quite close, and that might be useful to the EU because obviously the EU-Canada bilateral relationship is one which is important to both sides. And the other is, what kind of expertise on particular issues would Scotland bring to the table that might be useful to the EU in particular foreign policy questions? And again, I think that's something to be decided in due time, but whether that's on democracy and civic participation, or on different ways of approaching human rights, or if it's about cybersecurity or what have you, what will Scotland be offering that can help the EU in trying to achieve those aims of trying to have a stronger European position and advance it forward. In terms of Scotland's role in the United Nations, member states, I think I would like to think, and I hope that we all would like to think, that Scotland would want to be an active participant in working in the United Nations as the bedrock of the global system, challenged as it might be, but still crucial. Because, of course, that would align with Scotland's values, but it would also align with interests. And that's, I think when you take a longer term horizon, you recognize that interests and values often coincide in the same kind of action, as long as you take a longer perspective. So that's to say that ensuring that the United Nations is effective, that it can continue to develop in a way which benefits all member states, and ensuring that the rules-based international system, perhaps if it evolves, but is still functional in a way which various countries in different parts of the world have frankly undermined, and that includes the United States under the Trump administration. All those things are crucial to Scotland because Scotland would be a smaller state, and whether you're Scotland, whether you're Ireland or whoever, we would depend on a functional international system where states, there is international law, and states, most of the time at least, adhere to the rules. We would depend on that. It would be in our interest to see that work, in addition to recognizing why it would be useful in terms of a values context. So the UN is big, of course, and you have to prioritize what is important to you in terms of your engagement across the various parts of the UN system, as it's called. So it's not just the the core principal organs of the UN, but also the various specialized agencies and so on, be it the World Health Organization or the Food and Agriculture Organization and so on. What sort of priorities would Scotland have, and how could it work with allies, whether that be EU member states, of course, but also countries where Scotland might share particular priorities. And we can think of some of them. Norway makes sense. Obviously, Norway is not in the EU, but aligns with a lot of EU thinking on, I think, a kind of partner that Scotland could work with on issues of the United Nations. And then that links through to other aspects of the UN, which countries like Canada and Ireland and others have contributed to, which is peacekeeping, of course. And that is an area where Scotland could seek to make a contribution. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion in recent years about the kind of role that Scotland might be able to fulfill as a sort of peace builder or peace facilitator as part of its contribution to global progress. I think that is a very worthy objective. I also would say, though, that it's linking back to what I was saying before about internal, external action. If you wanted to have that kind of international profile, you need sort of a peace-building ecosystem in Scotland. It's not just about saying, we have a foreign policy on this and we want to sort of go out there and solve the world's problems. It's about creating networks of relationships with countries through the UN system. It's about sort of the research and academic expertise building, about engaging different parts of Scottish civil society, about ensuring that sort of that peacemaking wasn't just about what you're doing abroad, but also what about peacemaking here in Scotland too. So, linking all of that together, I suppose, and then, through the United Nations. I touched on it in the blueprint, and I wrote about it separately, about the prospects of Scotland one day being a non-permanent member of the Security Council. I think that's certainly a feasible objective. Obviously, that takes a bit of time. You normally need to announce that you're running for that about 10 to 15 years before the actual election takes place. So Scotland would need to be established at the UN first, and then obviously over a period of time, having sort of won allies across the various groupings in the UN to announce a candidature and work on it for multiple years, and then hopefully see it realized. So a longer term objective, perhaps. And then on sort of Scotland's relationship with different countries in the world, besides the international organizations. And obviously we have ancient links with countries in Europe and beyond, but it would be different under independence because, we would be engaging as states, and Scotland would be responsible for its own foreign policy in its own right. So, obviously this question of Scotland's relationship with EU member states, and Ireland has a policy of having an embassy in every EU member state. I think that's something that makes sense for Scotland too, because it demonstrates that you take your relationship with that country seriously, whether it be Germany or whether it be Slovenia. That being said, if you're a smaller country, you do need to prioritize your bilateral relationships. So I think it would be absolutely crucial for Scotland to invest in its relationship with France and with Germany. And then, of course, you think about countries that are natural partners, or perhaps not natural partners, but become partners for Scotland, if that's Ireland, if that's the Nordic EU member states, if that's the Baltic states, but others too. It's important not to be stuck in sort of, a concept of, well, we're like Finland and Ireland and they should always be our allies. It makes sense to work with Portugal or to work with Slovakia or to work with whoever in the EU, as long as it made sense for Scotland and aligned with our values and, could achieve something positive. It's always, useful to try to work with whoever you can in the EU, regardless of what member state it might be. But then, of course, there's relationships with other countries. The United States is still, occupies such an important role in the world. And of course, Scotland has a long-standing relationship with the United States. That is one where I imagine there would be a lot of investment. Different countries that I mentioned at the start have different approaches in terms of how many consulates, for instance, they have in the United States. But I can imagine Scotland having quite a few, on the order of 6 or so, which would be a substantial investment. But it's a question of, trying to link with the large Scottish diaspora in the United States. And I mean broadly defined, not just people who have Scottish ancestry per se, but anyone who has an affinity with Scotland. One of the wonderful things about a diaspora policy is about creating an inclusivity of people who are want to come to Scotland either to study or for tourism or what have you, and capturing all of that wonderful interest, combined with people who have Scottish roots, if you like. All of that is worthwhile. Embassies and consulates are a big part of that. Also, of course, about trade and investment. In both directions, and all of that together means that I think it's worthwhile to try to make that kind of diplomatic investment in the United States. in terms of a wider footprint, if you like. Then, of course, there's China, the great rising power in the world. It's not as if Scottish foreign policy would necessarily change the sort of foreign policy of China per se. And I think that's a useful example of how, by working in the European Union, for instance, and shaping EU foreign policy towards China, Scotland would be able to have more of a voice, because obviously, the EU, China, and the US are the larger entities which shape so much of what happens in the world. And by being successful in the EU, Scotland can therefore be successful in the world as well, if you like. And then, of course, just to conclude, perhaps, is Scotland's relationship with the UK. I do touch on that in the blueprint. And of course, I imagine we would all want to see a cordial relationship between Scotland and the UK, following an independence process. I think more work of, institutions for cooperation between Scotland and the UK in a sort of architecture for a shared island, if you like. Indeed, I'm working on that for one of my forthcoming reports. But needless to say, since we both share the same island, regardless of politics in Scotland or the politics in the UK, it's worthwhile to try to sustain positive bilateral cooperation. Best way to do that is through institutions, which sort of mediate some difficulties that may arise. And I think that's something to spend more time thinking about. So just to conclude, I'm very confident that as an independent state, Scotland could be successful and influential in the world for its size and position. I think working in the European Union and working through the United Nations will be core parts of that. Require a lot of work and effort, and what we would be doing at home, what we would be doing abroad. But I'm absolutely convinced that Scotland could, punch above its weight, I suppose, in the world.
Thank you for that. If anyone has any questions, you can start popping them into the chat box. I have one for, could Scotland's interests be best served by joining the Nordic Council to work closely on international affairs, defence and security?
Yes, so I think the Nordic Council is an important organisation for Scotland to have a relationship with. Of course, the members all have different positions, I suppose, in the sense that some of them, three are inside the European Union, and two, in terms of the full members, and two of the full members are not. And then within that, some are, one is in the Euro and two aren't, and so on. So yes, I think Scotland should have a close relationship with the Nordic Council. I'm not sure if it makes sense for Scotland to be a member, to be honest. I think the sort of starting point would be, some sort of observer status perhaps, but also to conclude a strategic partnership, which is what I set out in the blueprint, between Scotland and the Nordic Council or the Nordic Council members across a range of areas which make sense to both sides, and then see how that went. And then perhaps if it made sense for Scotland to become a member, if you like, then to move towards that step. And I think that's because the members of the Nordic Council, as they are at the moment, they have a lot in common, more than we do with them. Obviously, there's a great deal of shared history between Scotland and Norway and other countries and so on. But in terms of their policy similarities, linguistic similarities, and the rest, I think it would be about trying to see how things went, I suppose. But that links to the wider question, which is, in all of these circumstances, it's not just about what we would want, it's also what they would want, because, Scotland joining the EU or Scotland joining the Nordic Council or whatever would change the composition of those organizations and sometimes change how they work. And I think it would be important for us to recognize that we would be causing that change, and to listen and to see, what other members think about those things, and make sure that we, take that on board and decide what we would do.
Thank you for that. Can you give us a timeline for Scotland joining the EU and the main steps in that timeline?
I can, yes, because prior to the Global Blueprint, I wrote the EU Blueprint, which is a rather long report on how Scotland could join the EU. And the shorter version is that it would probably take Scotland between 4 to 5 years to join the EU, from the point of application to the point of accession. So there's a lot to say beyond that. First of all, that is not long, as it's sometimes portrayed. That was quite a fast process. And if it took 4 years for Scotland to join the EU, it would demonstrate they were very well prepared. Also, I would very much hope that prior to that accession process beginning, that Scotland and the EU would be able to come to a pre-accession, so a pre-membership relationship between Scotland and the EU, as I've set out, through an association agreement, which would provide for our relations with the EU during that period. So it's not as if we would be in a vacuum during those 4 to 5 years, for instance, that we would have a relationship with the EU, which I hope would include very good access to the single market and or the customs union. But obviously that depends on what was negotiated between Scotland and the EU, and perhaps potentially also the UK, if that was taking place during the transition to independence. But anyway, so in the EU blueprint, I set out 15 steps, as I broke the EU accession process down into 15 different steps of how you would go. So from day one of sending in the letter to the Council of the European Union saying, hello, we'd like to apply to the EU, through to the day that Scotland joins the EU. There are 4 main steps within that which take the most amount of time, which I suppose are the ones to focus on, perhaps. The first is the opinion from the European Commission. So after Scotland applies to join the EU, the Council will ask the Commission to prepare an opinion, it's called the avis, on how ready Scotland is at that particular time. In respect of meeting the famous Copenhagen criteria, these 3 main criteria for joining the EU. That can take some time on the Commission side, so it's not necessarily too much that could be done about that. The next step in the process, which takes a lot of time, is the screening process. So, after the Council has received that report from the Commission and says, yes, we want to begin negotiations with Scotland on joining the EU, the Commission will screen Scottish laws and policies. So it will study everything that we have in terms of our legislation and our policy practice and so on, to determine to what extent that matches with the EU acquis communautaire, which is the EU's bodies of rules and regulations, which every member state has to meet, and you have to meet in order to join the EU. That can take quite a lot of time. The third step, which takes time, is the actual negotiations. So each chapter of this acquis has to be opened and closed, and negotiated and then closed. Obviously that normally is the longest part of the process. Other things can happen alongside that. And the fourth longer step is after the negotiations are over. Once the negotiations are finished and they've been formulated into a treaty and the treaty is signed, the treaty has to be ratified by all the existing member states and also by Scotland too. And as I set out in the EU blueprint, I believe it is right that we would have a referendum at that point. It's potentially possible that other member states could have, or member states could have referendums too, but I think that's unlikely. So those are the 4 main steps. And I've set out in the blueprint how long I think each of them would take and why that makes sense. But yes, it's not a question of trying to sort of skip them in any way. Scotland is very well prepared, very well qualified to be an EU member state, and it is right that we would go through the normal process as any other candidate would, but that would be much faster than other candidates because of our degree of preparation and having been part of the EU before.
Thank you. Is there anything that could threaten Scotland's opportunity for EU membership?
I don't necessarily think so, no. So, if you go back to the Copenhagen criteria, they're sort of infamous, but they're really not that complicated. There are 3 of them. One is the political one. So that means, what state do you have in the way of democracy and human rights and the rule of law and so on. The second one is economic one. So, do you have a functional free market economy? Can you cope with being part of the single market? And the third one is the institutional one. So to what extent do you have the institutions and the structures to implement the rights and obligations of membership? So broadly speaking, I think that, we're extremely well qualified on the first one and the second one in terms of, we have been part of the European Union before for over 45 years. We know what it's like to be part of the single market. We used to be part of it. Of course, we have a democracy which is very deep and has a long tradition. The same thing with the rule of law in all of these areas. So yes, so then it comes to the institutional questions. And I think it's obvious to say, of course, we are not a state at the moment. So of course, there are some institutions that we would have to establish in our own right, be that a central bank or a competition authority or what have you. And that would take some time. It's a question of how much of that could happen during the transition to independence and how much of that might happen afterwards. And I suppose that's not an area where I would consider a threat in any sense of the word, but that's the area where the most work has to go into, I suppose. Now, of course, there are a number of a select number of issues which keep coming up over and over again in the respective EU membership, and one of them is the so-called Spanish veto. I'm not concerned about this. Obviously, various Spanish officials have said at different points that Spain would not sort of veto Scotland joining the EU, and as they say, as long as it was a constitutional process that Scotland took to become independent, if you like. But I suppose that links to the wider question, which is that in order to join the EU, you need every existing member state to agree. Not just mean agree at the initial stage of, we're going to apply, and every member state says, okay, that sounds great. Every single stage of the accession process in terms of what the decisions which are taken in the Council of the EU, which is, all the member states gathered together, requires unanimity. So they all have to agree. So if that's on the major decision like opening the accession negotiations, or if that's on opening or closing the individual chapters or whatever, at every single point, every member state needs to agree. So, I don't anticipate difficulties in that respect, but it's always possible that if something, came up between, Scotland and Slovakia, or Scotland and Finland, some sort of dispute or something, which again, I don't anticipate, but could happen. Any country could, say, we have a problem here, and sort of put the brakes on Scotland's accession process. Again, I don't expect that. But of course, the best way to avoid that happening links back to what I was saying before, which is to have good bilateral relations with every member state, regardless of how big or regardless of how small, from the earliest stage, to try to avoid any problems like that coming up and avoid them having any impact on Scotland's EU accession process.
Thank you. Other one we've got. What are the benefits of Scotland being outside NATO or neutral like Ireland?
Yeah, so I think it's a very important question. I didn't mention it in my opening remarks just because there's so many things to say. I think it's so first off to recognize that we are not in the same position as Ireland. I mean, I suppose it's obvious in the sense that we have been part of NATO from the beginning. We are not a neutral state. We've never been a neutral state, and I think it would be strange for us to try to become one, if you like, because. What is neutrality these days? It is less about not being part of military alliances, and is more about, what sort of global order do you want to align yourself with, for instance, because we have to be honest that there are competing systems. It's not about sort of East or West per se, because of course there are plenty of countries in both hemispheres who have different thoughts on how the world should be. But for instance, if Scotland were part of the European Union, a core part of the EU is to try to ensure that, the things I mentioned before about the rules-based international system, that it continues to exist, that it doesn't break down. I think it's perfectly clear that, be it China or other countries in the world, would be perfectly content for the rules-based international system to not be as it is at the moment, or to weaken, or to, I wouldn't say dissolve, but certainly something like that. So in that context of competition of values, it doesn't, in my view, make sense to be neutral, because if you want to say we're going to stay out of that, then that's not so great. So I think neutrality is outmoded and not something that makes sense in our present world. Also, it's worth sort of underlining that, that Ireland, of course, it has its military neutrality and is not in NATO, is not, depends in some respects on NATO for its defense. Like it depends on the UK, particularly in terms of air force capacity, which Ireland does not have, which the UK and NATO provide to it on an as-needed basis, if you like. So Scotland is not, so Ireland is not completely cut off from NATO anyway. So in that context, I think it's that's the kind of context that I imagine. Also, I suppose worthwhile to think of what are the kind of implications beyond. So, I would start at the beginning. So what makes sense for Scotland's defence and security interests, as Scotland, when we think about that. And then we think about, what makes sense in terms of our closest allies. And I suppose, again, if you were in the EU, the EU. So what does it make sense in terms of EU member states? Because it's not about the EU. It's not just being about, part of a market where you trade with each other and so on. It's about, taking other countries seriously. So for instance, when the Baltic states and Poland rather say, we particularly Baltic states, we have an existential fear of Russian aggression, not least considering what happened in Ukraine. And that's extremely important and serious to us. And that's why we're in the EU, and that's why we're in NATO. Scotland saying, okay, we understand that, we take that on board, and we're not just going to just, nod our heads and, say that we understand your concerns. We're going to actively do something to contribute to that defense of yours, because, we're allies here. And if, that means being in NATO, for instance, and we're part of that political and military alliance, then, that will be part of our contribution. So I think it's something, this is a debate which will have to be had, because there's clearly differences of views within the independence movement, perhaps more broadly, on whether or not Scotland should be in NATO. But I just think it's worthwhile to take that broader perspective of, not just about our core defense and security interests on their own, and obviously that should be the first place to start, but also about, the implications for our closest allies, and then, what kind of country we're going to be in the world, I suppose, and trying to, evaluate all of those different thoughts.
Thank you. Would sharing embassies with the remainder of the UK be of advantage or disadvantage, noting our inclusive international ideals versus the current hostile attitude of Westminster towards the international community?
Yeah, so this is an interesting concept of sharing embassies. I remember it from the 2014 referendum prospectus. I do not think sharing embassies makes sense. You do see that in some parts of the world. So, for instance, we talked about the Nordic countries. If you go to Berlin, the 5 Nordic countries, they share an embassy compound in Berlin. It's quite unique, in fact. And they actually have their own distinct buildings, but it's in the same sort of complex, which was designed for them. I don't think that makes sense for Scotland. Obviously there'd be greater cost, I suppose, in finding distinct premises in different parts of the world and sort of renting them or buying them and so on. But I consider that to be a strategic investment in Scotland's representation in the world. Because, what our embassies or consulates or whatever, they're sort of islands of Scotland in terms of values and interests and so on. And to my way of thinking, it makes sense to have, a distinct Scottish presence for all of those. And that doesn't mean that where it makes sense, for instance, for a Scottish embassy in wherever, be it in Canada or in South Africa, to work with the UK embassy there, where where it makes sense for Scottish and UK embassies that are in the same country to work together, then of course they should. There's nothing wrong with that, but I definitely think that it's worthwhile to have a distinct presence for Scotland in the world.
Thank you. What should we be doing right now to build better international relations?
I think this is a really important point because there is a lot that we can do regardless of the constitutional debate. So, I suppose we can look at, how Scotland can engage in the European Union, obviously from the outside and also not being a state, and how Scotland could engage with the rest of the world. I think in some respects, I suppose it, is perhaps easier and certainly more important in our engagement with the European Union, because of course, I've written a lot about, the ways in which Scotland can try and maintain its links with the EU. I think there are, maybe 2 or 3 things which come to mind. The first is the importance of, trying to sustain bilateral and multilateral relationships over the longer term. And that means that, identifying and working on areas where there's mutual interest. So, practical cooperation on areas of mutual interest, whether that be on climate change and renewable energy, to democracy and human rights, to whatever it makes sense, if it's between Scotland and Germany or Scotland and Slovakia or Scotland and Denmark, areas where both sides feel like they're gaining something from those relationships is crucial. And that links to my sort of other point, which again, I've also written about, which is, those relationships can't be about talking about independence, because that's not, but in terms of the Scottish government or other official actors engaging with those countries, I can't emphasize enough the importance of not talking about independence, because they're aware of our constitutional debate. That's not something you can sustain a bilateral relationship on for the years ahead. The second is what kind of contributions might Scotland want to make to the future of Europe, because we're still part of Europe. Just to say to the rest of the EU, that we're still here and we still are interested in the future of our continent. The EU is currently launching what it's called the Conference on the Future of Europe. I'd like to see if there is a space for Scotland, be that the Scottish government or us as civil society, to make contributions to that dialogue on the future of Europe. I'd like to see that. And generally thinking about the longer horizon here, because, regardless of when a referendum might happen, we know that it would take time for independence to be negotiated and then time for Scotland to join the EU. And that's a matter of years. And thinking, where would Scotland be at the end of that process in terms of its relationships with countries in the EU and so on. And then the rest, the rest of the world, the big wide world there. There's a lot. I suppose it's, which countries do you want to prioritize? We would always talk about the US and Canada, and they are important in different ways. There's, of course, Scotland has a special relationship with Malawi. There are other countries too, I suppose, that, might be useful partners for Scotland to sort of invest in, if you like, because it does have to be a choice because of the limited resources of the Scottish government under devolution. And, what do you want to focus on again on those countries? You can think about linking with the Scottish diaspora, as we talked about earlier. You can consider how much of it is about trade and investment, which of course are important. And the Scottish government, through Scottish Development International, has a number of offices besides the sort of Scottish government offices, if you like, which have been opened in recent years. You can talk about, a sort of values agenda. It's perfectly possible for Scotland to continue to be active in the United Nations. You don't have to be a member state of the UN to have something to say at the UN. Through that, and I suppose trying to link all of that together in a way which makes sense. So it requires a bit of strategy and choice making on sort of where you put your resources, I guess.
Can you see an independent Scotland adopting a diaspora strategy like the Irish government has?
Yes, I think it's certainly possible that Scotland could learn a lot from the way in which Ireland engages with the diaspora. Obviously, in a different context, in the sense that we have our own circumstances, that we will be becoming independent. Obviously in the 21st century. Even down to, for instance, we talked about the Irish diaspora with the United States, even that, the time in which the Irish diaspora mainly moved to the US is different from the time in which, the Scottish diaspora would have originally moved to the US, would have been earlier for Scotland in most cases. So taking all that into account, sure. But again, some of the reasons why I like the Irish diaspora policy is it links through to what I was talking about before, this importance of taking a holistic approach and considering what you do at home and abroad as well. So, for instance, I read all the manifestos of the election and I tweeted about them. And one of the things I noted was that the Scottish Conservatives mentioned the diaspora. I said, well, this is interesting. And they said how useful it would, how great it would be for Scottish business opportunities and to leverage their connections and so on. And there's nothing wrong with, talking about the diaspora, engaging with the diaspora for the purposes of trade. That's fine. But it's not about extracting things from them. And that's the key about the Irish approach. It's about a community, about linking people together who are from Scotland, who, have lived in Scotland, who like Scotland, who studied in Scotland, whatever, and bring all those people together in a spirit of friendship, where, yes, there could be economic and trade aspects, but it's also about culture, it's also about education, it's also about values, it's about all those things. And the Irish approach is focused on that. I like that. Also, the Irish strategy includes some funding for sort of immigrant support programs, and people, you can apply for that as an organization. I think that's worthy, again, showing that, it's not just about receiving things from the diaspora, it's also giving things to them too. And then taking that very broad approach. It's not about, do you have a Scottish accent, or were you born in Scotland, or, your family from Scotland? It's, do you just have an affinity with Scottish culture or Scotland, and then you're welcome to be part of that. I like all of those aspects, and I'd like to see them replicate here too. And again, most of that can be done now. It doesn't have to wait for independence.
Another one, would the EU be flexible regarding currency, and would the EU want to set limits on running a deficit?
Yeah, so these are important questions, again, very salient ones. They seem to come up a lot, I suppose. So on the question of currency, this all links back to the acquis that I was talking about, sort of all the EU's rules and policies and so on. And if you want to be a new member state, you have to satisfy them. You have to meet them all at the date you join the EU. And then from then on, obviously, you're part of trying to shape those rules. But the initial phase, you need to either implement them or agree something different with the EU. I think that the EU would be willing to show some flexibility with Scotland on the currency question, which is to say, for instance, would we have to have our own currency sort of, in order to be able to apply to join the EU and so on. I don't necessarily think so. I do think that the EU would find it odd if we, as a country as we are, a country as rich as we would be and are, not to have a currency. I think they might find that strange. But I imagine they would be willing to work with, whatever. So I guess we don't know what the circumstances would be, on the day in which Scotland applied to join the EU. Would we still be using sterling? Would we have our own currency? We don't know the answer to that. So it's kind of hard to judge how the EU would respond. But generally speaking, I think that the EU would be willing to be flexible as long as we demonstrated that there was a clear plan of what we were doing. So for instance, if we didn't have our own currency at the time when we applied to join the EU, that, there was a blueprint for, saying whatever, within the next 5 years or 10 years or whatever that seems reasonable, here is our plan for when we would be moving to our own currency. And I think that in the longer term, the EU would want to see that. So there's that. Then obviously there's the issue of the euro. Generally speaking, you don't move straight to the euro. I mean, you have your own national currency, and then you fulfill a number of steps, and you sort of, if you like, merge your currency into the euro. So you would normally have to have your own currency first. There is no requirement that you must join the euro in a particular timetable. But I hope that our debate can move beyond that kind of thinking, because the vast majority of member states are in the euro, and future ones will be as well. And there are disadvantages to being in that small group of countries who are not in the euro, not just in terms of economics, but in terms of your level of influence in the EU, because the Eurozone is one of the core aspects of the EU. And for us to, in the fullness of time, to be willing to have that kind of debate with ourselves of not just would we be forced to join the EU, the answer to that is no, does it make sense for us to be, in the euro? Does it make sense for us to be in the euro? And, should we actually think about it? So that's something for the longer term, I suppose, but worth keeping in mind. Now, on the question of the deficit, this is the national budget deficit. Yes, there are EU rules on sort of national budget deficits and national debts to try to, ensure the financial sustainability of the EU, I suppose, both within individual member states and the EU as a whole. This does include the famous 3%, so your budget deficit is supposed to be 3%. I am very confident that there will be flexibility on that in terms of what Scotland was negotiating with the EU during the process to join the EU, which is to say, if a Scottish government were to go to the EU and say, we've just become independent, we have unique circumstances here in the sense that we're spending a lot to try to build the institutions that I was talking about before, but again, here is our plan of how we aim to achieve the sort of deficit targets over a certain period of time and so on. The EU may have particular thoughts on whatever proposals are made, but I'm very confident that the solutions could be found on those questions. But I suppose it links back to the key point that I would make, which is that for any of the issues where Scotland was seeking something different or special, a huge part of it is not just about what you're asking; it's about how you ask it, in the sense that you have a clear plan and case of what you're proposing, and you have evidence and research and so on. Slightly contrasted how the UK conducted its Brexit process, for instance. And if you frame it all in those ways, the Commission will be able to look at this and say, okay, well, here we think about this. This makes sense. Here's this plan. And sort of internalizing, understanding how the EU works, and then when you go to make your requests, you're in that same frame of mind. It makes a massive difference, along with what you're asking for. But that still makes a massive difference to what the eventual response is from the EU institutions.
Thank you for that one. Many people speak about a queue to join the EU. Is there such a thing as a queue?
No. I suppose I could just leave it at that, but in the interest of discussion, I can fill that in. No, there's no queue. So, each country that applies to join the EU, its application advances at its own pace, And first of all, the European Commission, whether it be the Directorate General, which was responsible for enlargement negotiations, and joining the EU is the whole thing of joining the EU is called enlargement. The Commission multitasks. They can do more than one thing at once. Commission is one of the most professional civil services, in terms of the operations, if you like, in the world. They can handle more than one EU application, and in fact, they're doing that right now. How long your process to join the EU takes depends on you, the country in question. So if you're Scotland and you've been part of the EU before, and you're very well prepared on the aspects of the acquis, like we talked about previously, and you're in a very good position when it comes to the Copenhagen criteria, then of course, your application is going to be faster than if you were a country which was not in those circumstances. So no, there's no queue, but I suppose the wider point is, as I was mentioning, sort of in an indirect way previously, how long the EU accession process would take isn't just about the process. It isn't just about what the EU thinks. It's also about what we do. So, for instance, how quickly would we establish those institutions during the transition to independence? How much would we prepare for our eventual EU application during the transition to independence? All those things could shorten the amount of time that the EU accession process would take. So, in a sense, a lot of it would also depend on us.
Thank you for that. A large driver of Brexit was a lack of knowledge about how the EU works. How can we improve the public's knowledge of what it does and how it works?
Yes, it is a crucial point, of course, because, in my way of thinking, joining the EU is a major constitutional decision, because it changes how politics works. I suppose obviously, in the sense that members of the EU voluntarily transfer parts of their sovereignty to the European level, and obviously the Scottish government would be there along with all the other governments making decisions. There would be Scottish members of the European Parliament once again. In fact, there would be more of them compared to what we had previously, I'm sure. And there's all of those aspects, but I don't think we should take it for granted that there's a pro-EU consensus or majority in Scotland at the moment. That we should take the approach that should be sustained and should be renewed. That people can have confidence in why it makes sense for Scotland to join, but to continue to be in the EU, and not just in terms of interests, like I mentioned, of the single market, but also in terms of values. And I think we all have a role to play in that. It's not just about the Scottish government telling us, the EU is great, and we should stay in the EU, and whatever. It's about all of us being involved. So things that people mention, because of course this kind of lack of knowledge of the EU is not unique to the UK. It can also be the case in other and existing member states, continuing member states as well. People talk about education and ensuring that the EU is part of the curriculum. I think that's good. Talk about sort of school trips to Brussels to visit the institutions, and I think that's all great too. I think so politics and political education for basically everyone generally is nice, all of that, sure. But I think it needs to go wider than that. It's a question about our media reporting, in certainly much more detail than it does in the moment about EU issues. So that means journalists themselves being aware of understanding how the EU works, how we as Scotland fitted into that, and that they would develop their reporting on that so we could be informed, both through the eventual public broadcaster, which we would have, but also the rest of the media. It also is about politicians themselves, making sure that they are fully up to date on how, all the details on how the EU works, on the politics in the various member states, which will help them not just to inform their decisions, but also when they're communicating to the public what they're doing in Brussels, that they're up to speed on all of that. And you start to link all these things together. Also with politicians, our Scottish politicians being honest about the kinds of compromises that are required when you're in the EU, because, it's not about, of course, we're not going to get everything we want all the time. There's compromise, and sometimes we might win on a thing and we might say lose, but we might not get exactly what we want on a thing. And that's the whole point of multilateralism. But there's a tendency, and this is true in every member state, to sort of, as EU officials bemoan, to sort of Europeanize failures and nationalize successes. So something goes really well, you can say, this was us, this was Scotland, and if something's bad, you say, that's Brussels' fault. To not do that, to be honest and saying, there are some challenges here, and we're working very hard, and we're working with our allies, and whatever. So if you link all that of politicians being honest and being fully up to date on the details of the EU, a well-informed media providing us with kinds of information, the education aspect as well, and more generally just a healthy civic debate on European issues. I set a number of specific proposals in the EU blueprint on some ideas. One was sort of a standing, not a citizens' assembly in the sense of a one to come up with policy recommendations, but a sort of standing civic forum on European issues, where government ministers or senior civil servants and others would come on a regular basis and engage with members of the public and talk about what Scotland was doing in the EU, and actually listen to their feedback and incorporate what they were doing. Also increasing learning of languages as well. And when you add all of that together, I'd like to think we'd be in a place where, obviously it's not about telling people to like the EU. It's about ensuring that people have enough information to make their own informed judgment on what they think about the EU generally, and then specific aspects of how the EU works. And I think if we would do a collection of all those things, then we'd certainly be in a better place than the UK was throughout the duration of its membership of the EU.
Thank you for that. I was just wondering if you have anything you'd like to sum up with. We've had quite a lot of questions tonight already.
Yeah, well, I think that, both on sort of Scotland's relationship with the EU and joining the EU and foreign policy, there's so much to think about and discuss. And I suppose it's, I'm pleased. Sorry, I'm not entirely sure what I want to say to conclude, which is to say that I think it's really important that we debate these issues in detail. That's my thought. I know. I feel that oftentimes our debate is at the stage of should we be in the EU or not. And that's a perfectly legitimate, important question. As I said at the end, it's sort of in the middle. And I think it would be right to have a referendum, not at the very beginning of the process, but in the end, because that's what most countries do. Once the negotiations had finished with the EU, you have a referendum on whether or not you sort of approve the negotiations and then to join the EU. And having that kind of a more detailed discussion on sort of what kind of member state Scotland could be in the EU, and of course that includes the euro, but also on foreign policy and all these other issues. That I think that is something which is worth talking about now. It doesn't have to wait until after an independence referendum. And of course, other people are thinking about this. And Stephen Gethins wrote his book Nation to Nation. I know he spoke at a previous event of yours. I think that's fantastic. And just trying to say that, there's a lot that we can be talking about. There's a lot that the Scottish government and others, first of all, things that they're doing, but secondly, things they can be doing now. And I think when you add both of those together, a more detailed public debate on EU and international affairs in Scotland, plus what we as Scotland collectively, both government and civil society, can be doing on those things, regardless of the independence debate. And I think both those things together would move us into a better place from where we have been, in the sense that there's so much that we have to share and contribute to the world, and we do that in our different ways. But I'm sure that there's more that we can do, and I think it's worthwhile to try to do that.
Thank you so much for your time tonight. We've had lots and lots of questions submitted, really. And just want to say thank you all for coming as well. Thank you all. If there's any more questions and things, we can always forward them on to you. And we'll pop the links up on our social media for the various different blueprints you've done that we've got already. Thank you very much. Night, night all.
You've been listening to Indyliveradio, and that was another edition of our series, Changing Minds, Moving Forwards. And this week we were with the Aberdeen Independence Movement. The team here at Indyliveradio just want to say thanks again, folks, up in Aberdeen, for letting us broadcast the meeting. We really appreciate that, and it helps to spread the word about all the pieces we need in place for moving towards independence. If you want to contact the Aberdeen Independence Movement, you'll find them on Facebook and Twitter.